The Asylum. There is a perpetual darkness lingering in the hearts of man. Everyone says the real thing to be afraid of isn't some extraterrestrial entity or a man-eating cryptid that lurks out in the woods, but rather us. People. The everyday people that we see walking up and down the streets are the greatest forms of horror. Whether we acknowledge that or not is up to the person, I suppose. I subscribe to that notion, especially after seeing some of the darkest forms of people. I am now cautious just about everyone, but that doesn't prevent me from being the nice girl that I used to be. I am just more aware now and keep pepper spray on my keychain, as well as a hidden blade in one of my boots. I am a student up here in Alaska at one of the local community colleges. I work part-time at a sushi bar just across town, where if I work a full shift, I get to pick something off the menu for free. People call me Tess, but that's not my real name. I tell people it's short for Tesla, which always gets a laugh, and typically when I get people to laugh more, they tend to tip better. I have been trying to get back to my old, worry-free self, but it's been difficult. I force myself to look for the good in people, and I try to be more sociable. My therapist says it's for the best, and I'm inclined to agree. When I'm not slaving away at the sushi bar or struggling to get by my college classes, I like to investigate old buildings for paranormal activity. It's kind of like a scary Easter egg hunt, but with more of a goal of contacting the other side. I've been obsessed with ghosts ever since my father died when I was 7. There had been a handful of times where I had seen him since he died, which I have attributed to my natural curiosity for the unexplained. I felt the more I explored, the closer I would be to him, and that's all I really wanted right now. I was researching abandoned asylums when I came across one that was allegedly run by the military, where they would take patients and experiment on them with biological weapons. They say that this was one of the locations that inspired the well-known creepypasta, the Russian sleep experiment, despite not being in Russia itself, obviously. I suppose Alaska is close enough. Of course, this was all hypothetical, and no one knew for sure what the exact location or coordinates were, but there were a couple of posts on 4chan stating that they had found it in one of the forests a few towns over. Naturally, I thought this was too good to be true. However, my plan was to go check it out after my shift and see if I could make any progress on locating this elusive asylum. Once I would find it, I would conduct an investigation to see if I could get any results and potentially contact the other side to see what horrors were conducted at this facility. My Wednesday shift dragged on as usual, since the snow discouraged most customers from coming in. I would only be working half a shift. I would take the rest of the day trying to find the asylum. I wanted to make sure that I had enough time to properly search the forest before it got dark. One of my rules for myself is that I'm not allowed to be outside my apartment after dark, at least until I'm able to conceal carry a firearm at 21. The snow continued to blanket the sidewalks and local streets when Billy came in. Thankfully, I had less than an hour left in my shift and I wouldn't have to deal with him for very long. Billy was a regular who would come in 3 times a week and would ask for me specifically as a waiter. Billy was a larger man who I believe had suffered from severe burns at a young age. His burns covered half his face and most of the left side of his body. Billy had a quick temper and was very self-conscious about his appearance. After meeting him for the first time last year, I immediately knew he had some type of social disability. Me, being the nice person that I am, have always treated him kindly, and just like everyone else. I have a small scar just above my eyebrow, which gave me the briefest of ideas of what poor Billy had to endure on a daily basis. However, my sympathy for him had quickly fled a couple months ago, when he started exhibiting stalker-like behavior. He would get upset at the other waitresses when I wasn't here or if I attended other tables instead of his. What really freaked me out was when Billy's mother came in a few weeks ago and handed me an envelope full of money for being his girlfriend, which I obviously wasn't. I declined the money and told her that I was only his waitress when he would come in. She still offered me the money and told me to still take it for being his friend, which I still declined. I felt awkward in that situation. I felt if I had accepted the money, then I owed him something, which I did not want to set that expectation. So when he came in today, you could obviously tell how I felt. "Hey Tess," he said with a light and playful tone. "Table for one," he said with a smile. I could tell by the scarf and the lightly applied makeup on his face that he was trying to impress me. I could see sticking out of the coat pocket the same colored envelope that his mother had tried to offer me. I got Billy a seat near one of the TVs and changed the channel to one of his favorite sports channels that I knew he loved. "Wow, this is why you're my best friend," he said excitingly. I didn't know how to respond to that other than, "Mountain Dew to drink, right?" To which he smiled even wider and nodded. The sushi bar was unfortunately nearly empty, so I didn't have an excuse to hide away in the back or to serve other tables. Billy ordered his usual lunch rolls, but also ordered 2 additional rolls that just happened to be my favorite. I always recommend these 2 rolls, so I didn't think much of it, but when the food came out and placed all the rolls on the table, he placed my 2 favorite rolls across from him and invited me to sit down. I hadn't eaten that day, and I was in fact hungry, but I knew better. I hated the concept of gifts or people doing anything nice for me, because I always felt like I owed them something, which isn't fair. I declined his offer and he looked at me as if I just told a funny joke. He offered again and I just stood there. The playfulness in his voice began to diminish and the real Billy started to come out. Thankfully, the owner of the sushi bar was walking by but was somewhat aware of Billy and his past antics with young female waitresses. Mr. Johnson, the owner, tapped me on the shoulder and told me to clock out, and he would take care of my tables, despite me still having another 37 minutes left on my shift. I could not have ran out of there any faster, while also keeping my composure as if everything was normal. I was in the back room clocking out, and I could hear what sounded like the beginning of a shouting match in the dining room area. I didn't stay long enough to hear the whole argument, but I'm sure I would hear about it the next day when I clocked in. I ran outside to my old beat-up Jeep and cranked it on with the heat blasting. Before getting inside, I routed my phone to the forest a couple of towns over and put a hoodie that reeked of weed and cheap perfume on. The drive was going to be a couple of hours. I was hoping to get out of here before Billy was able to finish shouting at Mr. Johnson, so he wouldn't be able to follow me. I pulled out and drove by the front of the restaurant and saw that Billy was still inside, but rather than shouting at Mr. Johnson, he was just eating by himself. I felt a sigh of relief as I began my long drive off into the winter wasteland that Alaska had so unfortunately subjected to me that day. It was as if fate itself was trying to tell me to turn back and that today would be pointless to even try looking for this theoretical asylum that probably didn't even exist in the first place. But I was stubborn, and I didn't believe in fate. In fact, I was pretty unreasonable to begin with, I thought jokingly as I considered my options of what else I would be doing if I decided to turn back. Nothing came to my mind that was worthwhile. I didn't have any pets or a boyfriend to keep me company, so venturing off into the woods on a half day of work was all that remained as an option. The winter conditions slightly improved, but the visibility was still quite poor. The roads began to become more slippery as the snow silently fell. I began to get close to the town when I noticed a pair of headlights following me. A bit too close for comfort, especially with the slippery snow. I tried merging into different lanes, but the truck didn't miss a beat and continued to stay right behind me. I instantly knew that this could only be one person. At least that's what I thought. I pulled over in hopes that I was wrong and that the truck would continue to drive past. Thankfully for me, it did, but not without driving by very slowly. I saw as the truck drove by that it wasn't Billy, but rather some older-looking man. I got back on the road a couple of minutes after I drove by, just to make sure I didn't have an unwanted follower, especially since I was going to be out in the woods all alone. I wanted to keep it that way. I eventually made it to the town and found a good place to park my Jeep that was on the outskirts of the town. The town bordered the forest that I was going to investigate. I parked near what looked like an abandoned railroad depot. The railroad station itself looked quite interesting. If I couldn't find the abandoned asylum, this beautiful station would be a second best find. I loaded my gear into the old withered backpack that had patches of duct tape holding it together and set off into the woods. As I was about to enter the woods, a familiar pair of headlights pulled into the train station and parked right next to my Jeep. I quickly hid behind one of the trees as I saw what could have only been the same man from earlier get out and look inside my Jeep. He then looked around briefly before going back to his truck and putting on some type of mask. He grabbed something from the bed of his truck that was long and shiny. I could only assume the worst. He then entered the train station in an attempt to try to find me, and do who knows what. I waited to make sure that he was in there before I ventured deeper into the woods, unseen. Thankfully, the thick woods provided excellent cover. The steady stream of snow was surely going to cover my tracks before the crazy old man realized I wasn't inside and out in the woods. I let my emotions get the better of me, as I could feel cold stings of tears mixed with the frigid weather produce a painful cocktail of bitterness on my face. The surrounding woods provided an odd comfort. Even if the man were to look for me in here, it would be nearly impossible to find me. I made sure to leave landmarks in a way that, if the man did try to find me out here, he wouldn't be led straight to me, and so I could find my way back. My hike, as you would imagine, provided a very little reward, other than not being killed. The hour I spent searching, however, did lead me to a promising find, an old gravel road out in the middle of the woods, which told me that something was out here for sure. I checked the time and saw that I had about 2 hours left before the sun would set. Before I even debated on how to divide my time so that I wouldn't be left out here in the dark, something stood out to me in a way that both provided me with great joy but also a slight tinge of terror as I saw the gargantuan outline of multiple buildings connected. There were no signs or labels on the buildings or on the chain link fence that surrounded it, but sure enough, this had to have been the asylum. The fence was old and rusty, and the building itself looked like a monstrous skeleton of what was probably once a beautiful building, once upon a time. The building now only stood to remind the poor souls that had to look upon it that something atrocious had once happened here. If only a tenth of what I heard about this place was true, then I was guaranteed to find multiple tormented souls inside. The events from earlier had sufficiently escaped my mind. The elusive asylum was not only real, but surely some dark secrets that I was sure to find only lurked inside, and all I had to do was look. After spending a few seconds of admiring the glamorous facade of what I could only describe to be as the face of evil, I then began to make my way over the front gate of the fence and started to climb. The fence was old and rusty and had little support still holding it up. The fence clamored against itself as I tried to clear the top and quickly descend the other side. I checked the windows of the large empty building, half expecting to see someone peering out at all the noise, but thankfully my eyes didn't catch any movement inside. I walked up to the front door as I was inspecting possible forms of entry, and to my surprise, the clearly abandoned building was surprisingly well secure. All the doors were securely fastened, and the windows, despite some missing glass, had this weird wired mesh on the inside that prevented me from entering. Having not found this place would have been somewhat disappointing, but having found it not being able to enter is much greater in the sense of the word. I was determined to enter this building. Time had escaped me as I persisted in finding an entry. I did find a cellar door of some kind that had a large hole enough for me to fit into it, but after shining my flashlight down below, no bottom was in sight. I couldn't risk jumping down there and having no idea how deep it went. I was not willing to risk breaking an ankle or even a leg and not being able to get out, making this asylum my tomb that surely housed other unknown bodies. I continued my walk around the asylum, looking at all the levels of the building and noticed that the wire mesh on the windows didn't seem to be on any of the other interior windows, other than just the first floor. The exterior walls of the asylum were made of these smooth stones that protruded just enough that my fingertips could just get a decent grip. I would have to leave my bag behind in order to get up, but I could still bring my flashlight and take a few videos with my phone. I started to climb up to the second story, and I had greatly overestimated my abilities in climbing. I fell off a couple of times, only being a few feet off the ground each time, but I soon found a path upwards that had large enough stones to make the most out of the lack of climbing skills that I had. Only being about 10 feet off the ground, I tried opening the second story window. I couldn't get a good grip on any part of the window. I even tried pressing upwards on the glass to get it to slide up, but nothing. I positioned my body in a way that I could rest while not falling back down to the first floor by pressing my back against the windowsill and wedging my feet on the other side. I glanced up to see that the sky was now getting darker. Night was surely to come way before I'd be able to get back to my Jeep. I wasn't overly worried since I had been in the woods at nighttime before. As I was resting to regain more strength, I hit the window out of frustration and saw that the frame of the window had moved quite a bit. I did it again, and while the glass remained intact, the old wooden frame holding the glass in place began to give. While wedging myself with my feet and my back, I gave a handful of sturdy elbows to the old window, and sure enough, I was able to pop the glass out and into the asylum. My excitement had clouded my judgment. I wasn't thinking about how much noise I was making until the glass fell and shattered on the ground. I held my breath as the brief thought of not being the only one here had just crossed my mind. I listened for a response to all the noise I was making. Thankfully, I was only met with more silence. I shined my flashlight around the inside of the building before jumping in. I was inside some kind of old office that was missing a door and allowed me a brief glance into the hallway. Normally in all these kind of ghost hunts, old buildings and solitude did not bother me. In fact, I found it very peaceful, and it allowed me to meditate in some macabre way. However, something about this place did not give me peace. This place radiated evil amongst other things, but evil most of all. I knew that this building was something that I shouldn't be in, but worst of all, this was a place that shouldn't have even existed at all. I stepped inside on the broken glass, which gave a couple of cracks underneath my poorly insulated shoes. The office still had materials inside which looked out of place but not overly dirty. It just looked like someone had left and never came back, and time took over the rest. The floors and some of the walls had black mold on it, which caused me to cover my face with my hoodie as to not breathe it in. I peered out into the dark hallway with my flashlight. Normally I would begin conducting a paranormal investigation, but seeing how I left the majority of my instruments outside, all I could really do was try to record some audio on my phone, while I asked questions and investigated the rest of the asylum. I had this cool app on my phone called Spirit Box. It would basically repeat any sounds beyond the frequency of normal hearing. Basically, it would allow me to do EVPs without my EVP device. Technically, I could climb back down to get my bag, but that would take me another 15 minutes to climb back up to the window. Realizing it was practically dark outside, I figured it didn't really matter what time I got back since it was already too late. I began asking questions as I walked around the desolate asylum. The questions did not yield any results, at least at first, but to be honest, I was more preoccupied with finding some kind of earth-shattering evidence proving what evil had been done here. But unfortunately, the documents I was looking for were nowhere to be found. All that I could see were these empty rooms. Some rooms had furniture that were completely outdated, while others were completely empty. I continued my questions to the paranormal. My phone would sometimes make strange sounds, or the occasional one word which didn't make any sense. I asked the question, where can I find proof of what happened here? When I got the response, proceed. My ears perked up, and there was definitely a presence here that was willing to communicate. I soon approached the first stairwell that was both going upwards and downwards. I asked where to go. I could now hear what sounded like a multitude of people whispering over one another when my phone caught a single word clear as day. descend. I went down the stairs and arrived at the main floor, but the stairs still continued downwards. Before I could even ask the question, my phone repeated the same word: descend. I did, however, notice that my sense for caution started to rise. I continued downwards and noticed that the stairs continued well below the main level. It was to the point that there were at least 3 or maybe even 4 levels below the main level. I continued all the way down when my phone then alerted me with 2 words from the Spirit Box app. It said stop and caution. I shined my light around the bottom level, which resulted in a completely different atmosphere than the rest of the asylum. Rather than the normal decay of time and neglect, this bottom level had an undeniable touch of maintenance. The bottom level was still incredibly dark, but the long corridor of doors had electronic locks that slightly glowed a dull green. Some of the doors had light coming through the bottom, signaling a presence inside. I went to turn to go back up and leave the asylum before I gave away my presence to anyone that remained here, but the app spoke to me. Evidence ahead. Caution. I was in a unique situation that I might not ever get again. I could prove to the world that not only did this place exist, but also what things had happened here. I decided to turn away from the stairs and entered the long corridor. I put in my AirPods to connect to my phone as to minimize the sound coming from my phone, while still using the Spirit Box app as a guide to get me through this undetected. Some doors had light spilling out from underneath the frames while others were dark. One of the doors I was about to pass seemed to be of some importance, since my phone began to go crazy with words. The word halt was repeated a half-dozen times before numbers were being told to me. The numbers made no sense until I realized that the door had a keypad above the handle. It took me a couple of tries, but eventually, the numbers being told to me were given in the correct order, that I was able to correctly input the numbers and unlock the door. Inside the room was a modern computer with up-to-date furniture and a common decoration you would find in most offices. Hanging up on the wall was a coat hook with a lanyard that had a plastic key card. I grabbed the lanyard and put it around my neck and began my search for any files I could find in this place. I went over to one of the 3 filing cabinets and began searching. The files dated back to the early 1950s. Some files had official documents while others had graphic images of what looked like to be human experiments. Things only got stranger the more I searched and compiled documents. The human experiments seemed to have slowly morphed into what I could only describe to be as demons. As I was mystified at the information that was laid in front of me, my AirPods then told me to hurry, which I took as my cue to get out of there. I had grabbed a fraction of what was there in terms of evidence, but this should have been plenty. I left the room and made my way back to the stairs when I heard one of the doors behind me open. I didn't look back as I sprinted up the stairs. As I was halfway up the stairs, I could hear sirens being sounded many floors below me. I had either been seen or someone must have went into the office and noticed that the filing cabinets had all been opened. Along with the sirens, I could also hear screaming below me that sounded as if it was ascending up to me at a quick pace. I finally made it to the 2nd floor and found the room with the window that I had entered the asylum in. The screams were now incredibly close, which caused me to jump from the window rather than trying to climb down. The 10-foot fall surprisingly didn't do much damage to me, as I landed in such a way that displaced my weight across both legs. With my adrenaline pumping, I was able to shake off the pain, which I knew eventually was going to be a bruise. My horrific pursuit with whatever was inside had ended, and all that I needed to do was to climb that fence out of here and make it back through the forest. I eventually got up and walked over with a slight limp over to the fence. I started to climb up when I then saw something that horrified me. On the other side of the fence illuminated a flashlight. For the briefest of moments, I thought perhaps it could have been another hiker, or at worst, perhaps an asylum worker. It wasn't until the person held up the flashlight to their face, much like how one would do when telling a scary story. The light revealed a clown mask from the man that had been following her from earlier at the railroad station. I could also see that he was still holding that very large knife from earlier, which I was sure that he was going to use on me. This hit me like a ton of bricks. I quickly limped back over to the wall under the window, where I had jumped from to try to climb. I could hear the rattling of the fence behind me, and knew it wouldn't be long before the man would soon clear the fence and would be harming me. I tried climbing the wall, but it was going to take too long and I was kinda hurt. I then could only think of one other option to potentially evade this soon-to-be attacker. I hobbled over to the cellar door that had no bottom in sight, and before I thought twice, I jumped. I was hoping that the man would peer down and see that it would be unwise to follow me. Worst case scenario is that either the fall kills me or leaves me severely injured and I die in a slow and painful death by myself. I don't ever remember landing in the dark basement. I just remember waking up and feeling incredibly sore all over. My left arm was definitely broken. I could feel a sticky sensation on my face from what I assumed to be dried blood, and worst of all, it hurt so bad when I tried to breathe. I tried feeling my side with my good arm, which instantly sent pain across my entire body. I was now wheezing with intense pain when I heard the sound. I looked around the basement to see that I was in a dark room. I couldn't find my flashlight, so I reached for my phone in my pocket. I turned on the flashlight setting on my phone to reveal a medium-sized room. To my utter horror, inside the room was what looked like to be a pale man on all fours. His face was that of nightmares, and to try to put it to anything else other than a demon would be impossible. His face lacked eyes, only scratched out sockets from where eyes once peered. His mouth was unusually large, and bore large yellow teeth with hardly any gums holding them in. The person wasn't wearing any clothing, but its body was so scratched up and torn that there was no indications of if this was a male or female. I soon realized why I wasn't being swarmed by this large creature. Holding this creature back was a large chain connecting it to the furthest wall, leaving about a 10 feet distance between us. The creature was silent, although swaying back and forth while clawing at its collar with its bony hands. I then heard a sound behind me and saw a flashlight peering down into the cellar door. To my dismay, I saw a rope slowly descend. The man above me was now slowly rappelling down into this hellish basement with me. My chance of getting out of here were slim to none, but I still had to do something. I could either try to rush him once he came down, or I could try to hide. The room had random odds and ends, but other than that, there wasn't much to hide in. I saw a barrel that was tipped over in the corner, and I crouched behind it while turning off my flashlight. It didn't take long for the man to finally set foot in the basement, leaving the rope against the wall, so he still had a way out. I knew that with my broken arm that this still would not be an option for me, but before I could think any more about the subject, the man began searching for me by sweeping his flashlight across the basement. I heard shifting coming from the corner of the room that had the creature, and the man went running towards it thinking that it was me. Before the man and the creature collided, I heard a shriek come from the man, and peeked up to see that he was just out of reach of the creature, and was shining his light right into its face. The man was still holding the long blade in his left hand down by his side. There was no way I would be able to fight the man with a broken arm, and having no weapon. However, the idea crept devilishly across my mind that perhaps I didn't need to fight him. Thankfully, the man was facing away from me and completely distracted by the creature. I got up as quickly as I could without making any noise and sprinted towards the man's back and shoved him with all my might. The shove didn't knock him over or even dislodge the blade from his hand. In fact, I don't even think the shove even hurt him in any degree. However, the shove did accomplish its single goal. The small distance that once stood between the creature and the masked man had now been closed thanks to my forceful shove. He then quickly turned around, and despite his face still being covered by the mask, his eyes revealed a horrifying glare. Not horrifying in the sense that he was going to kill me, but in the way that he realized that he was now going to die. Before the man could even act or say anything, my instincts were correct, and the creature quickly pounced on the man and started shredding him as if his clothes were made of paper. The light that he was holding was soon dropped alongside his knife, to which I quickly went over and picked both up. I began searching for another way out, while the man was wailing in terrible pain. The creature wasn't screaming, but rather made slurping sounds, which made me think the worst. During the chaos in the basement, the flashlight I was holding found a familiar sight of a green keypad that I saw from earlier. This keypad was different from the others, and rather having numbers on the keypad, it had a slide for a card. I felt around for the lanyard that once hung around my neck and was relieved that it was still there. I gave it a quick swipe with my good hand, and sure enough, the door opened and revealed the familiar side of the long corridor from earlier. However, standing on the other side of the door was a bearded man with glasses. The man was wearing business casual clothing and a pair of glasses. The man spoke to me in another language and pointed behind me, to which I pointed the knife at him. "Stay back," I mustered with what little energy I had. The man put his hands up, showing me he was unarmed, and pointed to my lanyard. I looked briefly and saw that his photo was indeed on the key card, but he was shaved. I handed him the lanyard, which he put on and waved me to follow him. I was hesitant, but the pain I was experiencing from the shove had caused me to start losing my breath. I had no choice but hope that this man had the best intentions. I remember my head feeling light and not being able to get a good full breath of air when I passed out. I woke up sometime later in a small hospital room with bandages on my arm and part of my face. I felt numb for the most part, but I was able to breathe again. The nurse in my hospital room told me that I was found already bandaged on the front steps of the hospital, wearing a blanket. One of my lungs had collapsed from one of my many broken ribs puncturing it. They told me that after performing some x-rays that all the corrective procedures had already been applied. All that they had to do was give me some pain medicine to numb some of the pain. I still had my phone, but all the information from my ghost hunt had been erased. I also noticed any information I had previously saved about the asylum had also been erased. After a day or two, I was released from the hospital and saw that I was still in the small town in which I parked my Jeep. I could see down the road the familiar silhouette of the abandoned train station. A light snow began to pick up and the sun was rising. One of the nurses saw me standing there at the entrance of the hospital and asked if I needed a ride. I glanced over, still in bandages, and gave a soft smile. "I'll be fine," I said with a slight wheeze in my voice. I then left the hospital and slowly started limping off to get my car.